Adolf Hitler: How a Homeless Painter Became a Monster in Sleep documentary. This is an educational documentary presented for historical and educational purposes only. Hey guys, tonight we step into a narrow street in a small Austrian town where the air smells faintly of chimney smoke and damp wool coats, and somewhere inside a modest apartment a baby begins to cry, a thin, insistent sound that no one could possibly mistake for history clearing its throat. You stand there in the hush of the 1890s, watching shadows flicker along stucco walls, unaware that this fragile life will one day redraw maps and scorch continents. It feels almost absurd, doesn't it, that something so small could grow into something so catastrophic. You probably won't survive this, not because of anything dramatic, but because tracing this path honestly means confronting how ordinary beginnings can twist into monstrous outcomes. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 a.m? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together here on Timeless Sleep. You are in Braunau am Inn, a quiet border town between Austria and Germany, on April 20th, 1889, a date that will later be circled in red ink by historians for all the wrong reasons. The boy born here, Adolf Hitler, is the fourth child of Alois and Clara Hitler, though several of his siblings will not survive childhood. Infant mortality is common in the late 19th century, and grief lingers in the household like dust in the curtains. His father, Alois, is a customs official, stern, self-made, and intensely proud of climbing from illegitimacy to middle-class respectability. His mother, Clara, is gentle and devoted, her affection forming a soft counterweight to the rigid authority of her husband. You can almost feel the tension in the small rooms, boots placed precisely by the door, a clock ticking too loudly, a father who expects obedience without hesitation. Alois wants his son to follow him into the civil service, to wear a uniform and keep ledgers and maintain order. But the boy you are watching is thin, pale and dreamy, with a stubborn streak that simmers beneath his quiet exterior. He sketches in the margins of his schoolbooks. He stares at buildings as if they are alive. He grows especially captivated by grand architecture, churches with soaring ceilings, opera houses glowing in lamplight. In school, he performs inconsistently, he excels when interested, drifts when bored. Teachers describe him as capable but unfocused. It is not yet destiny you see, only adolescence, prickly and restless. Mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. His relationship with his father is deeply strained. Alois reportedly beats him when defied, and arguments erupt over career choices. The young Adolf refuses the civil service path with theatrical stubbornness, insisting he will become an artist. You can picture those confrontations, the boy gripping a pencil like a weapon, a father slamming a fist onto a wooden table. It's almost painfully ordinary. Many teenagers clash with their parents. The difference, of course, lies in what happens next. When Alois dies suddenly in 1903, the household's axis shifts. The Iron Authority vanishes overnight. Clara shields her son from hardship as best she can, and you sense how fiercely attached he becomes to her. Years later, he will describe her death from breast cancer in 1907 as the most devastating event of his life. The doctor who treated her, interestingly, was Jewish, a detail that complicates later narratives in uncomfortable ways. History rarely fits neatly into the boxes we try to build for it. As you drift through his teenage years in Linz, you notice his fascination with German nationalism. Austria-Hungary at this time is a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Jews, and more woven into a complicated political fabric. Yet the young Adolf grows increasingly enchanted by the idea of a unified German nation. He devours stories of heroic myths and attends performances of Richard Wagner's operas, soaking in their dramatic themes of destiny and struggle. There's a theatricality taking root in him, a sense that life is not merely lived, but staged. And here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost surreal in hindsight. As a boy, he was reportedly terrified of thunderstorms. You can imagine him as a child pulling blankets over his head while lightning splits the sky, seeking comfort in the very household he often resisted. It's a strangely human detail, a reminder that even future tyrants once feared the dark like any other child. You follow him to Vienna in 1907, where he carries a portfolio of drawings and an inflated sense of artistic promise. Vienna is dazzling, a capital of culture, music, philosophy, and also seething political tension. The city's Ringstrasse glitters with imperial grandeur, cafes buzz with debate. Sigmund Freud is probing the human mind not far away, and you, trailing this hopeful 19-year-old, can feel how desperately he wants to belong here. He applies to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. The entrance exam requires a portfolio and a drawing test. His submission includes architectural sketches, detailed, precise, but when asked to draw human figures, he falters. The Academy rejects him. The official feedback suggests he has talent for architecture, not painting. It is a pivotal moment. You watch him read that rejection notice, jaw tightening. He applies again the following year and fails once more. No acceptance letter arrives to rescue him from himself. With his mother gone and his inheritance dwindling, he drifts into poverty. By 1909, he is living in men's hostels, sometimes sleeping in shelters. He sells watercolour paintings of Vienna's landmarks to tourists and frame shops, small tidy scenes of buildings, largely devoid of people. That absence is striking, isn't it? Streets without crowds, architecture without humanity. It's almost symbolic, though you resist over-interpreting. Sometimes a painting is just a painting. Still, you can't help noticing. Vienna at the turn of the century is also a hotbed of political radicalism. Anti-Semitic rhetoric circulates openly in newspapers and speeches. Karl Lueger, the city's mayor, employs populist and explicitly anti-Jewish messaging to gain support. The young Adolf absorbs this atmosphere. He later claims that Vienna is where his anti-Semitic worldview crystallizes. Historians debate the extent to which these years shaped him versus later experiences, but there is little doubt that the city exposes him to ideological currents that will harden into obsessions. You walk beside him through cold winters, breath fogging in the air, pride preventing him from seeking stable work that might feel beneath his aspirations. He reads voraciously, newspapers, pamphlets, nationalist tracts. He argues in hostels. He begins to see himself not as a failed applicant, but as a misunderstood visionary. That subtle shift from I was rejected to the system is corrupt, is small but potent. Many people nurse grievances. Few nurture them into worldviews. And yet, at this stage, nothing about him is inevitable. You could pass him on the street and think little of it. A thin young man with intense eyes and worn cuffs on his coat. A dreamer nursing disappointment. The tragedy of this story is not that evil appears fully formed. It accumulates, slowly like frost creeping across a window pane. As the years in Vienna drag on, he grows increasingly isolated. Friendships are shallow. Romantic relationships are non-existent. He constructs an identity built on resentment and imagined destiny. He admires strong leaders, despises parliamentary squabbling, and romanticizes struggle. There's a theatrical loneliness about him, as if he's casting himself in a grand drama that no one else realizes is being performed. You sense, even now, the dangerous alchemy forming, personal failure fused with ideological certainty, poverty mixed with pride, grief layered over ambition. None of these ingredients alone guarantee catastrophe, but together, in the right historical moment, they can ignite. And as you stand in this dim Viennese hostel room, watching him roll up another modest watercolour to sell for a few coins, you might wonder how different the 20th century would look if the Academy had accepted him, if a professor had nudged him toward architecture school, if a small validation had redirected the current. History rarely hinges on a single letter, but sometimes it feels that way. The lamps outside flicker, the empire hums uneasily, and the young man you follow stares at the city's grand buildings as if they owe him something. You feel the air growing heavier with unspoken expectation, as if Europe itself is holding its breath. You linger in Vienna as the years stretch thin, watching the young man who once imagined himself a celebrated artist drift further into the margins of the city's glittering fade, and the contrast is almost poetic in its cruelty. Outside, the imperial capital dazzles with orchestras, cafes and intellectual ferment inside the men's hostel on Meldemant Street, where he eventually finds a more stable bed. The air smells of boiled cabbage and damp wool, and conversations hum with bitterness, ambition, and political speculation. You can almost hear the scrape of wooden chairs and the low murmur of men debating empire and ethnicity late into the night. It is here, in these communal rooms, that he spends long hours reading newspapers and pamphlets, absorbing the rhetoric of pan-German nationalism and racial theory that circulates so freely in early 20th century Vienna. One mainstream historical fact anchors this period firmly. Between 1909 and 1913, Adolf Hitler lives in relative poverty, supporting himself by painting small watercolours of buildings and selling them through middlemen, while residing in shelters and later in the men's home. He is not yet a political leader, not yet even a formal activist, but you can feel ideas hardening inside him like cooling metal. You walk beside him through the city's districts and notice how his gaze lingers not on people, but on structures, parliament buildings, opera houses, grand boulevards, as if architecture represents order in a world he increasingly perceives as chaotic. He speaks with certainty about politics despite having no formal education beyond secondary school. He rails against Marxism, which he associates with social upheaval, and against what he sees as the weakening of German identity within the Austro-Hungarian Empire's multicultural framework. Vienna at this time is governed by Mayor Karl Lueger, whose populist and openly anti-Semitic politics demonstrate that prejudice can be packaged as civic virtue and win elections. You sense how such examples reinforce the young man's belief that sharp rhetoric and emotional appeal can move crowds. It is less about careful policy and more about performance, a lesson he quietly internalizes. There is a curious, almost surreal tidbit from these years that feels like an odd footnote to history. He develops a strict personal routine, reportedly abstaining from alcohol for long stretches and living frugally, even rigidly, as if discipline could compensate for instability. Some accounts suggest he was meticulous about his appearance despite poverty, brushing dust from his coat before entering public spaces, clinging to dignity as a shield against humiliation. You picture him standing before a cracked mirror in a shared washroom, adjusting his collar with exaggerated care. It's a small human detail, but it hints at the pride that underpins so much of his later persona. By 1913, the atmosphere in Vienna grows tense not only politically, but personally. He faces the possibility of being conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army, something he wishes to avoid. He feels little loyalty to the multinational empire, and instead romanticizes Germany to the north. In May of that year, he leaves Vienna and relocates to Munich, in the German state of Bavaria. You follow him by train, the countryside sliding past the window in muted greens and browns, and you sense that this move is both escape and aspiration. Munich feels more aligned with his cultural identity, more purely German in his eyes. Yet even here, he remains largely anonymous, living quietly and continuing to paint architectural scenes for modest income. Then, in the summer of 1914, the world fractures. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sets off a chain reaction of alliances and ultimatums, and Europe stumbles into what becomes World War I. You stand in a Munich square as crowds gather, cheering the declaration of war with a fervour that to modern ears feels incomprehensible. For many young men, war promises adventure, purpose, and unity. For him, it offers something even more intoxicating: belonging. A mainstream historical fact marks this turning point clearly. In August 1914, Adolf Hitler volunteers for the Bavarian army and is accepted, despite technically being an Austrian citizen. He is assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and soon finds himself on the Western Front. You move with him into the trenches of Belgium and France, where the romantic glow of patriotic fervour dims under the weight of mud, artillery, and exhaustion. The Western Front is a landscape of barbed wire and cratered earth, where days blur into nights punctuated by shell fire. He serves primarily as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between units, a dangerous role that exposes him to frequent risk. He is wounded in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme, and later temporarily blinded in 1918 by a gas attack. For his service, he receives the Iron Cross, First Class, a relatively rare decoration for someone of his rank, awarded for bravery. This recognition reinforces his sense of personal valour and destiny. You can almost see how the uniform, the structure, the hierarchy provide the clarity he craved in civilian life. There is an often overlooked, quietly ironic detail from his wartime experience. Several of the men in his regiment, including at least one officer who recommended him for the Iron Cross, were Jewish. The complexity of these relationships sits uneasily against the virulent ideology he will later champion. History rarely conforms to simplistic narratives. It is layered, contradictory, and deeply human in ways that defy later myth-making. As the war drags on, conditions deteriorate, supplies thin, morale fluctuates, and the initial optimism fades into grim endurance. Yet he reportedly thrives within the regiment's structured environment, forming attachments to comrades and finding purpose in service. When Germany's final offensives fail in 1918, and the tide turns decisively against the Central Powers, the sense of impending defeat hangs heavy. You stand beside him in a military hospital in Pasewalk in November 1918, where he recovers from gas exposure just as news arrives that Germany has sought an armistice. The Kaiser abdicates. Revolution ripples through German cities. For many soldiers, the war's end brings relief. For him, it feels like betrayal. This reaction becomes central to his evolving worldview. A mainstream historical fact underscores the political context. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposes heavy territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations on Germany. Many Germans perceive the treaty as humiliating and unjust. In the chaos of post-war transition, conspiracy theories flourish, including the stab in the back myth, which falsely claims that Germany's army was undermined by civilians, socialists, and Jews rather than defeated militarily. You can sense how such narratives resonate with someone already inclined to externalize blame. Personal disappointment finds a national echo. He returns to Munich in a Germany transformed, no longer an empire but the fledgling Weimar Republic, struggling with political extremism from both left and right. Street clashes erupt between communist groups and nationalist paramilitaries. Inflation looms. Uncertainty saturates the air. He remains in the army for a time, assigned to a propaganda and education unit tasked with monitoring political groups. It is in this capacity, in 1919, that he attends a meeting of a small organisation called the German Workers' Party. You follow him into a smoky beer hall, where a handful of men debate nationalism and socialism in rough, impassioned tones. At one meeting, he speaks up, arguing forcefully against a proposal. His intensity catches the attention of the party's founder, Anton Drexler, who invites him to join. This is a modest moment, almost forgettable in scale, a fringe group with minimal influence, yet it marks the beginning of his formal political career. You can feel the shift, from listener to speaker, from anonymous veteran to emerging agitator. His oratory, fueled by conviction and theatrical cadence, begins to draw attention. In these cramped beer halls, he discovers that words, delivered with rhythm and fury, can command a room. And as you stand there, the smell of hops and tobacco thick in the air, you sense the convergence of all that came before. The frustrated artist, the disciplined soldier, the grieving son, the resentful nationalist. The stage is small for now, the audience limited, but the voice is growing steadier, louder, more certain. Europe is weary from war, Germany wounded in pride, and in the flickering light of a Munich beer hall, a new ambition begins to take shape. You remain in that smoky Munich beer hall, the air thick with hops and resentment, and you begin to notice how the young veteran's voice changes when he speaks. No longer tentative, no longer drifting like a failed art student searching for approval, but sharp, deliberate, rising and falling, with a rhythm that pulls heads toward him almost against their will. The German Workers' Party is small, barely more than a discussion club in 1919, Yet in this fragile post-war Germany, small groups matter. The Weimar Republic is struggling to stand upright. Revolution has shaken Berlin. Communist uprisings flare in various cities, and right-wing paramilitary groups roam the streets with barely concealed hostility. Inflation is beginning its cruel climb. People are searching for explanations, and explanations, even flawed ones, feel like comfort. One mainstream historical fact grounds this transformation. In 1920, the German Workers' Party renames itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, and Adolf Hitler becomes one of its most visible and dynamic speakers. You watch him step into that role with unsettling ease. His speeches are not polished academic lectures, they are emotional performances. He identifies enemies, simplifies complex economic and political realities into digestible blame, and repeats key themes until they settle into memory. He rails against the Treaty of Versailles, denounces Marxism, and increasingly fixates on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, presenting them not as opinions but as revelations. You can almost feel the room heating as he speaks, boots scraping on wooden floors, fists pounding tables in agreement. The power of repetition becomes one of his tools. He understands instinctively that ideas, repeated often enough and delivered with conviction, can begin to feel like truth. It is less about nuance and more about momentum. You follow him as he refines his image. The small moustache, later so infamous, becomes part of a carefully managed persona. There is a quirky but revealing tidbit from this era. Early photographs show him experimenting with different moustache styles before settling on the short, square toothbrush cut, reportedly because it fit better under a gas mask during the war. It is an oddly practical origin for something that would become globally symbolic. You imagine him trimming it before a mirror, unaware of how iconic and reviled it would become. By 1921, he manoeuvres himself into leadership of the party, leveraging his popularity as a speaker to demand control. He threatens to resign if not granted full authority, and the party relents. This moment is critical. The structure of the Nazi Party becomes increasingly centralised around his authority, a pattern that will later define the regime itself. You sense how personal ambition and ideological fervour merge seamlessly. He does not see himself as merely a politician, but as a vessel of national destiny. The party adopts the swastika as its emblem, repurposing an ancient symbol into a modern banner of extremism. Uniformed stormtroopers, the SA, or Sturmabteilung, begin to appear at rallies, projecting strength and intimidating opponents. Politics is no longer only debate, it is spectacle. Germany in the early 1920s is a nation staggering economically. In 1923, hyperinflation spirals out of control. You stand in a Berlin marketplace watching people carry wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread, their savings rendered nearly worthless. A loaf that once cost a few marks now costs billions. This is not metaphorical exaggeration, it is documented reality. Middle-class families see lifetimes of security evaporate in months. In such conditions, radical promises can sound reasonable. Stability, pride, revival, these words land heavily. Sensing opportunity in chaos, he and other nationalist leaders attempt a bold move in November 1923. The Beer Hall Putsch. You follow him into the Bürgerbrukeler in Munich, where Bavarian officials are addressing a crowd. He bursts in with armed supporters, fires a shot into the ceiling, and declares a national revolution. The plan is to seize control of Bavaria and then march on Berlin, echoing Mussolini's earlier march on Rome. For a brief moment, the room is electric with confusion and fear. Yet the coup is poorly organised. Key military and political figures withdraw support. The next day, marching through Munich streets, the putschists are confronted by police. Shots are fired. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen are killed. The uprising collapses almost as quickly as it began. This failure could have ended his career. Instead, it becomes a stage. Arrested and charged with treason, he stands trial in early 1924. You sit in the courtroom as he transforms the proceedings into a platform, delivering long speeches that frame him as a patriot betrayed by weak leaders. The judges, sympathetic to nationalist sentiment, allow him wide latitude. He is convicted but receives a remarkably lenient sentence, 5 years in Landsberg prison, of which he serves only about 9 months. The mainstream fact here is stark. The Weimar legal system, intended to defend democracy, treats him with surprising indulgence. It is one of history's bitter ironies. Prison, however, is not a dungeon in the medieval sense. Landsberg is relatively comfortable. He receives visitors, dictates his ideas, and begins work on a book that will become Mein Kampf. You picture him pacing a cell that feels more like a modest study, articulating a world-view that blends autobiographical narrative with racial ideology and expansionist ambition. He outlines the concept of Lebensraum, living space, arguing that Germany must expand eastward to secure territory and resources. He frames history as a racial struggle, positioning Jews as a central enemy in a grand conspiracy. These ideas are not entirely new in European thought, but he weaves them into a coherent, emotionally charged doctrine. There is something almost chilling in how methodical this period becomes. The failed coup teaches him a lesson. Power cannot be seized recklessly, it must be acquired legally, then reshaped from within. You sense the strategic pivot forming. Upon his release in late 1924, he finds the Nazi Party weakened and temporarily banned, yet he moves quickly to rebuild it. He restructures the organisation, establishes regional leaders, Gauleiters, and emphasises disciplined messaging. Propaganda becomes systematic rather than spontaneous. Rallies are choreographed events with banners, music, and carefully timed speeches. Politics becomes theatre, and he its central actor. Meanwhile, Germany experiences a brief period of relative stabilisation under the Dawes Plan and foreign loans. The economy improves modestly in the mid-1920s. For a time, extremist parties struggle to gain mass support. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, the Nazi Party wins only 12 seats out of 491, a marginal presence. You might be tempted, standing here in 1928, to assume the movement will fade into obscurity. Many contemporaries do. Yet beneath the surface, the organisational groundwork continues. Then, in 1929, the global Great Depression strikes. The collapse of the US stock market reverberates across the Atlantic. American loans to Germany are recalled. Banks fail. Unemployment soars into the millions. You walk through German cities again, seeing shuttered factories and long bread lines. Economic despair returns with renewed intensity, and this time it is intertwined with global uncertainty. The Nazi Party capitalises on this crisis with ruthless efficiency. They promise jobs, national revival, and a rejection of Versailles. Electoral support surges. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, they win 107 seats, becoming the second largest party. By July 1932, they secure 230 seats, the largest single party in Parliament. You feel the momentum building, like a storm gathering strength beyond the horizon. What began in cramped beer halls now echoes in massive rallies. Airplanes carry him across the country in innovative campaign tours, projecting modernity and dynamism. He presents himself as Germany's saviour, a leader who can restore dignity and unity. The irony is heavy. Democratic processes are elevating a man who openly disdains democracy. And as you stand in the midst of cheering crowds, banners snapping in the wind, you sense that the fragile guardrails of the Weimar Republic are beginning to bend under pressure. The voice that once struggled to gain admission to an art academy now commands stadiums. The grievances of a defeated nation have found a conductor. The next steps will not be taken in secrecy or shadows, but in broad daylight, through appointments, negotiations, and calculations that will alter the course of the century. You stand in Berlin in the early 1930s, the air brittle with uncertainty, and you can almost hear the machinery of democracy grinding under strain as politicians shuffle in and out of office, coalitions collapsing almost as quickly as they are formed. The Weimar Republic, already fragile from economic catastrophe and political extremism, now feels like a stage set wobbling under the weight of too many actors pulling in opposite directions. President Paul von Hindenburg, aging and increasingly detached, relies on advisers and emergency decrees to govern. Elections produce fragmented parliaments incapable of stable majorities. Into this vacuum steps the man you have been following from hostels and trenches to beer halls and courtrooms. By January 30th, 1933, a mainstream historical fact crystallizes into reality. Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. It is not through a coup, not through tanks rolling through streets, but through a legal appointment engineered by conservative elites who believe they can control him. You watch the ceremony unfold with an uneasy awareness that they are underestimating the very force they have invited inside. The appointment is the result of backroom negotiations. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen and other conservative figures imagine they can harness his mass support while containing his radicalism within a cabinet dominated by traditional nationalists. They see him as a useful instrument, a populist figurehead, who can stabilise the government and suppress communism. You sense the miscalculation immediately, like a chess player overlooking a piece that will soon change the board. Hitler, far from being a pawn, understands power as something to be consolidated relentlessly. He wastes no time. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire erupts on February 27, 1933. Flames consume the German Parliament building, and a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, is arrested at the scene. Whether he acted alone remains debated by historians, but what is undisputed is how the event is used. The following day, the Reichstag fire decree is issued, suspending key civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy of communication. Police powers expand dramatically. You can almost feel the constitutional fabric tearing. This is the first decisive step in dismantling democracy from within. Fear becomes a political tool, and fear is remarkably persuasive when presented as protection. In March 1933, another pivotal mainstream fact unfolds. The Enabling Act passes in the Reichstag, granting Hitler's cabinet the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval, effectively sidelining the constitution. The vote is conducted under intimidation, communist deputies are absent, many already arrested, and SA men line the chamber. Only the Social Democrats vote against it. You stand in that hall as the measure passes, sensing how a democratic system can, under pressure and manipulation, vote away its own safeguards. The legal framework of dictatorship is now in place. The process known as Gleichschaltung, coordination, begins almost immediately. Political parties other than the Nazis are banned or dissolve under pressure. Trade unions are dismantled and replaced with the German Labour Front. Regional governments lose autonomy as power centralises in Berlin. Civil servants, teachers, judges and cultural figures are required to align with the regime. You watch as institutions that once functioned independently are gradually synchronised to a single ideological rhythm. It is not always dramatic. Often it is bureaucratic, paperwork stamped and regulations amended. Yet the cumulative effect is profound. A quirky yet telling detail emerges in these early months of consolidation. The regime invests heavily in spectacle and symbolism, choreographing mass rallies at Nuremberg with almost obsessive attention to visual impact. Architect Albert Speer designs grand stages and lighting, displays that transform political gatherings into theatrical experiences. Searchlights create cathedrals of light in the night sky. You imagine standing among thousands, the beams stretching upward like pillars, music swelling, banners rippling. The experience is immersive, emotional, designed to dissolve individuality into collective identity. Politics becomes ritual, and ritual fosters loyalty. Meanwhile, repression sharpens. The first concentration camps, such as Dachau, were established in 1933 initially to detain political opponents, communists, socialists, dissenters. At this stage, they are instruments of intimidation and control, though they will later become sites of far greater horror. The Gestapo, the secret state police, expands its reach, encouraging citizens to report suspicious behaviour. Trust erodes as surveillance seeps into daily life. You feel the atmosphere tighten, conversations growing cautious, glances lingering a second too long. In June 1934, another decisive moment consolidates authority, the Night of the Long Knives. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, has grown powerful and restless, with some members pushing for a second revolution that threatens traditional elites and the army. Hitler moves decisively against them. Over several days, Röhm and other perceived rivals are arrested and executed without trial. This purge reassures the military and conservative supporters that he will maintain order and discipline. A mainstream fact underscores the outcome. After President Hindenburg dies in August 1934, Hitler merges the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Frere. Soldiers swear an oath not to the Constitution, but to him personally. The transformation from Chancellor to dictator is complete. You walk through Germany in the mid-1930s and notice changes both visible and subtle. Propaganda saturates public space. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrates messaging across radio, film and print. Cheap radios, the Volksempfänger, are distributed to bring speeches into homes. Education curricula shift to emphasise racial ideology and loyalty. Youth organisations like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls expand rapidly, shaping young minds with songs, uniforms and camps that blend camaraderie with indoctrination. It is systematic, generational. Economic policies focus on reducing unemployment and rebuilding infrastructure. Public works projects, including the construction of the Autobahn network, provide jobs and visible signs of progress. Rearmament accelerates despite restrictions imposed by Versailles. Factories hum again. For many ordinary Germans, daily life appears to improve materially, even as freedoms shrink. This duality complicates the narrative. Support for the regime is not solely coerced, but also cultivated through tangible economic change. You sense how prosperity, or the perception of it, can dull resistance. At the same time, persecution intensifies. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws codify racial discrimination, stripping Jews of citizenship and prohibiting marriage between Jews and Aryans. Legal language transforms prejudice into state policy. You imagine families reading official notices that redefine their status overnight. Shops are boycotted, professions restricted. The process is incremental, normalised through bureaucracy and propaganda. There is an almost chilling irony in a minor anecdote from this era. Hitler reportedly maintained a relatively modest personal lifestyle compared to some other dictators, preferring vegetarian meals and simple routines at his mountain retreat, the Berghof. Visitors described afternoons of tea and conversation overlooking alpine vistas. The contrast between pastoral calm and the machinery of oppression unfolding across Europe is stark. It is a reminder that monstrosity does not always announce itself with constant fury. Sometimes it coexists with mundane domesticity. By the late 1930s, Germany's rearmament and assertive foreign policy reshaped the European balance of power. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, and the Munich Agreement later that year, allowing Germany to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, unfold with limited immediate resistance from other powers. You stand in cheering crowds in Vienna as German troops enter, flowers tossed into the streets. Many greet the Union enthusiastically, illustrating how nationalism can blur the line between coercion and consent. Each step emboldens further ambition. Each concession by foreign leaders reinforces the belief that boldness will be rewarded. The regime's confidence swells. Internally, dissent has been crushed or driven underground. Externally, opposition appears hesitant. You feel the tension building, like a taut wire stretched ever tighter. The boy who once sketched buildings in Vienna now commands a nation mobilizing for expansion. The legal mechanisms are secured, the opposition silenced, the population largely aligned or intimidated. As you stand on the brink of the next chapter, you sense that the consolidation of power was not an endpoint but a prelude. The structures are in place, the ideology is codified, the ambitions, once whispered in beer halls, are about to be tested on a continental scale. You feel the air change in Europe in the late 1930s, as if the continent itself senses that the careful balance of diplomacy and denial cannot hold much longer, and you stand on the edge of September 1939, knowing that the machinery assembled over years of speeches, laws, purges and parades is finally about to be set in motion. The annexations of Austria and the Sudetenland had unfolded with a mix of intimidation and international hesitation. But when German forces cross into Poland on September 1st, 1939, the illusion of limited revision collapses. A mainstream historical fact marks the rupture cleanly. Britain and France declare war on Germany 2 days later, and World War II begins. You watch as columns of soldiers move eastward under grey skies, tanks grinding across fields, and you sense how the ideology that once simmered in pamphlets now translates into artillery and occupation. The invasion of Poland is swift and brutal, executed with a coordinated strategy later described as blitzkrieg, lightning war, combining fast-moving armoured units, motorised infantry, and air power to overwhelm defences. Within weeks, Poland is divided between Germany and the Soviet Union under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement signed in August 1939. The pact itself is one of history's striking ironies, two ideologically opposed regimes temporarily cooperating to carve up Eastern Europe. You imagine the quiet shock among observers who had expected bitter enmity, not pragmatic collaboration. For Hitler, the pact is tactical, buying time and securing his eastern flank while he focuses westward. As 1940 unfolds, German forces sweep through Denmark and Norway, then launch a daring offensive through the Low Countries and France. The fall of France in June 1940 stuns the world. Paris, once a symbol of European resilience and culture, now lies under occupation. You stand in the forest of Compiègne as French representatives sign an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had capitulated in 1918. The symbolism is deliberate, almost theatrical revenge. It feeds the narrative of historical correction that Hitler has long promoted. For a moment, it appears that his gamble has paid off spectacularly. Much of Western Europe is under German control or influence. Crowds in Berlin celebrate victories with flags and music, and you can feel how triumph reinforces belief. Yet even in victory, there are limits. The Battle of Britain begins in the summer of 1940, as German aircraft attempt to gain air superiority over the United Kingdom in preparation for a possible invasion. The Royal Air Force resists fiercely. Bombing campaigns devastate cities on both sides, but Britain does not surrender. This is a crucial mainstream fact. Germany fails to defeat Britain from the air, and Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, is indefinitely postponed. The war becomes broader, more complex, less predictable. You sense frustration creeping into strategic calculations. In June 1941, the conflict expands dramatically with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Despite the earlier pact, Hitler launches a massive offensive eastward, driven by ideological goals of destroying Bolshevism and acquiring Lebensraum. Millions of soldiers advance across vast territories. Initial successes are rapid, with large Soviet forces encircled and captured. You stand in the dust of advancing columns, hearing engines rumble and commands barked in clipped tones. The scale is staggering, the front stretching thousands of kilometres. Yet the campaign soon encounters fierce resistance, logistical strain, and the brutal Russian winter. The assumption of a quick victory proves disastrously optimistic. It is in the East that the regime's racial ideology manifests with horrifying clarity. Mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, follow the army, carrying out mass shootings of Jews, political commissars, and others deemed undesirable. This marks a radicalization of persecution into systematic mass murder. By 1942, the Wannsee Conference formalizes plans for what the regime calls the final solution, the coordinated, industrialized genocide of Europe's Jewish population. You do not dwell on graphic detail, but you acknowledge the magnitude. Approximately 6 million Jews are murdered during the Holocaust, alongside millions of other victims including Romani people, disabled individuals, and political prisoners. This is not collateral damage of war, it is policy. The bureaucratic precision with which it is organised reveals how ideology, when fused with state power, can produce mechanised atrocity. Amid this vast machinery, there are strangely mundane details that feel almost surreal. One quirky tidbit often noted by historians is Hitler's increasing preoccupation with his health and diet during the war years. He adheres to a largely vegetarian regimen and consults personal physicians who administer a bewildering array of medications and supplements. In the midst of directing colossal military campaigns, he obsesses over digestive discomfort and insomnia. You picture him at headquarters, maps spread across tables, while aides adjust schedules around his strict routines. The contrast between global catastrophe and personal fussiness is jarring, almost absurd in its ordinariness. By late 1941, the war becomes truly global. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December draws the United States fully into the conflict. Germany declares war on the United States shortly thereafter, widening the battlefield beyond Europe and North Africa. Industrial capacity now plays a decisive role. American factories surge into production, Soviet industry relocates east of the Ural Mountains, and the Axis powers face enemies with vast resources. You can feel the balance beginning to shift, slowly but inexorably. Turning points accumulate. The Battle of Stalingrad, ending in early 1943, results in the encirclement and surrender of the German Sixth Army, a devastating blow both militarily and psychologically. In North Africa, Axis forces retreat. Allied bombing campaigns intensify over German cities, reducing industrial centres to rubble. You stand in Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah, seeing firestorms consume neighbourhoods, civilians fleeing through smoke-filled streets. The war that once seemed distant from many German households now arrives at their doors. Confidence erodes. Internally, cracks appear. Some military officers begin to question leadership decisions, particularly as Hitler increasingly interferes in tactical matters, refusing retreats and demanding unrealistic offensives. In July 1944, a group of conspirators attempts to assassinate him with a bomb at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The explosion kills several officers, but fails to kill its intended target. The plot collapses, and retribution is swift and brutal. This mainstream fact underscores how dissent, though present, is fragmented and ultimately suppressed. Loyalty is enforced not only by ideology, but by fear. As 1944 progresses, Allied forces land in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, opening a Western front that accelerates Germany's collapse. Soviet armies push from the east, reclaiming territory at immense human cost. Cities fall one by one. You walk through Berlin streets, now scarred by bombing, buildings hollowed out, civilians navigating ruins with stoic resignation. The triumphant rallies of the 1930s feel like echoes from another lifetime. Throughout these years, propaganda continues to promise ultimate victory, framing setbacks as temporary and urging total commitment. Goebbels calls for total war, mobilizing every resource. Yet reality intrudes relentlessly. Fuel shortages cripple mobility. Air superiority belongs increasingly to the Allies. Refugees stream westward ahead of advancing Soviet forces. The grand ambitions of continental domination shrink into desperate defence. You sense how the arc that began with personal grievance and political theatre has culminated in continental devastation. Tens of millions have died across Europe and beyond. Cities lie in ruins. Entire communities have been erased. The ideology that once promised renewal has delivered catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. And as you move closer to the war's final phase, you feel the geography tightening, the vast maps on headquarters walls contracting into a single encircled capital. The leader who once addressed cheering crowds from balconies now spends more time in fortified bunkers, issuing orders to divisions that exist largely on paper. The contrast between the sweeping conquests of 1940 and the defensive desperation of 1945 is stark. The storm that began with speeches in Munich has consumed continents, and now its centre is collapsing inward, drawing everything toward a final, claustrophobic reckoning beneath a shattered city. You descend now into Berlin in early 1945, and the city feels less like a capital and more like a wounded organism, its streets torn open, its buildings skeletal against a grey, ash-heavy sky. The Red Army advances relentlessly from the east, while American and British forces press in from the west. The maps that once sprawled confidently across Europe have shrunk to a tightening ring around the Reich's heart. You walk through neighbourhoods where tram lines twist uselessly above rubble and civilians move in hushed, exhausted currents, carrying what little they can salvage. The grand proclamations of inevitable victory have faded into strained radio broadcasts and brittle optimism. And beneath the ruins, in a reinforced concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the man you have followed from provincial Austria to continental war now lives in narrowing corridors of artificial light and recycled air. The Fröhr bunker is not a cavernous lair of cinematic fantasy, but a cramped, low-ceilinged complex of rooms, damp and poorly ventilated, where maps are still updated with coloured pencils even as divisions they represent cease to exist. A mainstream historical fact anchors this final chapter. By April 1945, Soviet forces have encircled Berlin, and Adolf Hitler has chosen to remain in the city rather than flee south to the Alps, despite suggestions from some advisors. You can almost hear the distant thud of artillery above ground as you stand in those narrow hallways, the vibrations travelling through concrete. The war that began with sweeping offensives and triumphant marches has contracted into defensive fantasies and impossible counterattacks drawn on paper. Inside the bunker, daily life follows a strange routine. Secretaries type communicus. Military officers present situation reports that grow increasingly detached from reality. Hitler, now visibly aged and physically diminished, meets with generals and insists that non-existent armies will break the encirclement. Witnesses later describe his trembling hands and stooped posture, symptoms possibly linked to Parkinsonian features, though historians continue to debate medical specifics. What is not debated is the strategic collapse. The German military infrastructure is shattered, supply lines severed, and communications fragmented. Yet he clings to belief in willpower as a substitute for material strength, as though sheer determination might reverse the tide of history. There is a surreal, almost domestic detail from these final weeks that feels painfully human in contrast to the destruction above. Evenings in the bunker sometimes include tea, simple vegetarian meals, and conversations about art, architecture, or even films. Traudl Jungi, one of his secretaries, later recalls moments of banal normality, as if the apocalypse outside were a distant rumour rather than an encroaching reality. You picture porcelain cups clinking softly while artillery booms overhead. It is a jarring juxtaposition, ordinary gestures suspended within extraordinary collapse. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet assault on Berlin intensifies. The Battle of Berlin becomes a brutal, street-by-street struggle. You walk above ground for a moment, witnessing civilians digging makeshift defences, young boys from the Hitler Youth handed anti-tank weapons, elderly men drafted into the Volkssturm militia. The regime that once promised strength now leans on children and pensioners to defend its capital. It is one of the war's bitter ironies, a movement built on militarised youth ends by sacrificing that very youth in a futile defence. Inside the bunker, tension tightens. Reports grow darker, communications falter. On April 22, during a military briefing, Hitler reportedly erupts in anger when informed that a counter-offensive under General Steiner cannot proceed because the necessary forces simply do not exist. It is a moment of reckoning, the realization that commands issued no longer translate into action. You sense the psychological rupture, the gulf between imagined control and stark reality. The structure of authority that once radiated outward across Europe now collapses inward, unable to project power even a few kilometres beyond the bunker's walls. Meanwhile, news arrives of betrayals and defections. Heinrich Himmler attempts to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies without Hitler's knowledge. Hermann Göring sends a telegram suggesting he should assume leadership if Hitler is incapacitated. These moves are interpreted as treachery. In the claustrophobic atmosphere of the bunker, trust erodes further. Orders are issued for arrests, loyalty questioned at every turn. The regime that thrived on centralised control now fragments under pressure. On April 29, 1945, in the early hours of the morning, Adolf Hitler marries Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony within the bunker. It is a starkly intimate act set against the backdrop of total defeat. Eva, who had remained largely in the background of public life, chooses to stay in Berlin despite opportunities to leave. The marriage lasts less than 40 hours. That same day, Hitler dictates his political testament, blaming the war and international conspiracies, and reaffirming his ideological convictions even as the Reich collapses. There is no public apology, no acknowledgement of catastrophic miscalculation. The narrative remains defiant to the end. A mainstream historical fact closes the sequence with grim clarity. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler dies by suicide in the bunker as Soviet forces close in on central Berlin. Eva Braun also takes her own life. Their bodies are carried outside, placed in a shell crater, and burned according to his instructions, an attempt to avoid the public humiliation he had witnessed in images of Mussolini's corpse displayed in Milan days earlier. The act is both final and symbolic, a refusal to face capture, a last assertion of control in a situation defined by loss of it. Above ground, the battle continues for days. On May 2, Berlin surrenders to Soviet forces. On May 7, Germany signs an unconditional surrender at Reims, effective May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe is over. The continent is scarred beyond easy comprehension. Tens of millions are dead. Cities lie in ruins. Borders will be redrawn. Trials will follow, most notably at Nuremberg, where surviving leaders are prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ideology that fueled expansion and genocide is exposed to global scrutiny, documented in painstaking detail. You step back now from the bunker's concrete walls and look across the broader landscape of consequence. The Holocaust survivors face displacement and trauma that will echo across generations. Germany itself is divided into occupation zones, later solidifying into East and West during the Cold War. Europe's political map is reshaped. International institutions such as the United Nations are established in hopes of preventing future catastrophes on similar scale. The 20th century is permanently marked by the regime's rise and fall. And yet, as you reflect on the arc you have traced, from a child in Braunau am Inn to a failed art applicant in Vienna, from decorated soldier to demagogue, from chancellor to dictator, from triumphant conqueror to bunker recluse, the most unsettling realization may be how gradual the transformation was. There was no single lightning strike that created a monster overnight. There were grievances nurtured, institutions weakened, fears amplified, opportunities seized, and checks ignored. Ordinary mechanisms, elections, laws, appointments were bent toward extraordinary ends. The bunker, in its final silence, becomes less a dramatic stage and more a cautionary chamber. Concrete walls cannot shield against consequence. Maps cannot command reality. Ideology cannot suspend physics or supply lines, or the accumulated resistance of millions. The war ends not with a triumphant speech, but with muffled gunshots beneath a ruined city. And as the smoke clears over Berlin, you sense that the story's final echo is not the sound of artillery, but the quiet question that lingers in its aftermath. How did so many steps, each perhaps seeming manageable in isolation, lead to such immense devastation? The answer is not simple, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. You remain in the hush that follows the gunshot in the bunker, but now the sound fades, absorbed into layers of dust and memory, and you slowly rise above the broken streets of Berlin as if lifting through smoke that no longer burns, but still carries the scent of something irretrievably altered. The war in Europe is over, yet the silence that follows is not peaceful at first. It is stunned, disbelieving, heavy with the weight of what has been uncovered. Allied soldiers move through camps, through towns, through administrative offices where meticulous records sit in cabinets as if waiting for routine inspection, and the scale of systematic persecution becomes undeniable. A mainstream historical fact anchors this reckoning. Between 1945 and 1946, the Nuremberg trials prosecute leading Nazi officials for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, establishing legal precedents that will shape international law for decades. You stand in that courtroom as evidence is presented, documents, testimonies, film footage, and you sense how the abstract rhetoric of ideology is being translated into concrete accountability. The trials do not resurrect the dead, nor do they erase trauma, but they mark a global attempt to articulate boundaries, that aggressive war, genocide, and systematic brutality are not merely political choices but crimes. The language forged here, crimes against humanity, becomes part of the moral vocabulary of the modern world. It is a sober, deliberate process, far removed from the fevered rallies and theatrical speeches of the 1930s. You feel how history, when examined in the light of documentation and cross-examination, loses some of its mythic haze and becomes painfully factual. Numbers are counted, orders are traced, responsibility is assigned. Germany itself is divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France. Berlin, the city that housed the final bunker, is split as well, eventually hardening into a symbol of Cold War division. You walk through streets where rubble women, Schirmerfrauen, clear bricks by hand, rebuilding not just structures but civic life. A quirky yet poignant tidbit from these years emerges. In the immediate post-war period, cigarettes function almost as currency in black markets, traded for food and services in a shattered economy. It is a small, almost mundane detail, yet it captures the improvisational survival of ordinary people navigating collapse. Grand ideology has dissolved, now daily life revolves around bread, coal, shelter. Denazification programs attempt to remove former party members from positions of influence, though implementation varies widely across zones. Some individuals face prosecution, others reintegrate quietly into society. The process is uneven, complicated by the emerging rivalry between Western allies and the Soviet Union. As the Cold War intensifies, priorities shift from thorough purging to strategic alignment. You sense the tension between justice and pragmatism, between moral reckoning and geopolitical calculation. Beyond Germany, the consequences ripple outward. The Holocaust leaves millions displaced. Jewish survivors, many with no homes to return to, migrate to new countries, including what will become the State of Israel in 1948. Europe's borders shift westward as Poland's territory moves and German populations are expelled from Eastern Europe in vast, painful migrations. The demographic map is redrawn in ways that will influence politics for generations. You stand at railway stations crowded with refugees, suitcases clutched tightly, eyes scanning for direction in a continent that feels both liberated and fractured. As decades pass, memory itself becomes contested terrain. Monuments are erected, museums established, archives opened. In West Germany, a gradual process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, unfolds, sometimes haltingly, sometimes defiantly. In East Germany, the narrative frames fascism as a capitalist aberration defeated by socialist resistance. Different political systems shape different remembrances. You notice how history is not only what happened, but how it is told, retold, and integrated into national identity. Meanwhile, scholarship expands. Historians debate motivations, structures, and responsibility. Was the regime driven primarily by one man's will, or by broader currents of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and economic crisis? The answer, you sense, resists simplicity. Individuals made choices, institutions enabled them, populations responded with varying degrees of support, fear, or resistance. The story you have followed is not a fairy tale with a single villain conjured from nothing. It is an intricate web of decisions, opportunities, failures, and ambitions interacting within a volatile historical context. There is another curious footnote that surfaces in post-war years. Rumours and conspiracy theories proliferate, suggesting that Hitler survived and escaped to distant lands. Despite overwhelming historical evidence confirming his death in April 1945, such myths persist in fringe circles. They reveal something about collective psychology, a reluctance to accept finality, or perhaps a fascination with unresolved endings. Yet the documented record, supported by forensic investigation and eyewitness testimony, remains firm. The bunker was the end. And now, as you let your gaze drift from courtrooms and reconstruction sites to classrooms and libraries in the present day, you sense the enduring relevance of this history. The 20th century's most devastating conflict did not arise from a vacuum. It emerged from economic instability, wounded national pride, entrenched prejudice, charismatic leadership, institutional weakness, and international miscalculation. Each element alone might have remained containable. Together, they became combustible. The lesson is not abstract. Democratic systems require vigilance. Economic despair can distort judgment. Language can normalize exclusion long before violence begins. These are not dramatic revelations delivered by thunder, they are quiet patterns observable in hindsight. The pace of the story slows now, like footsteps easing from a march into a measured walk. You remember the narrow street in Braunauer Inn where this journey began, the Art Academy rejection letter in Vienna, the muddy trenches of World War I, the beer halls, the courtroom at Landsberg, the torchlit rallies, the shattered cities, the bunker's dim corridors. Each scene felt immediate in its moment, yet together they form an arc that reshaped continents. The transformation from obscure youth to dictator was not magic, it was incremental, built on structures that failed to restrain ambition and on audiences willing, at times, to believe. As night settles gently over a rebuilt Berlin, glass towers rising where rubble once lay, you feel the air soften. Traffic hum replaces artillery. Cafes glow where propaganda banners once hung. History does not disappear. It settles into museums, memorial stones embedded in sidewalks, names etched in metal and stone so that absence is never entirely invisible. The city breathes differently now, aware of its own layers. And you, having walked this long, strange path, allow your shoulders to ease. The story has been heavy, yes, but understanding carries its own quiet strength. You do not need to carry the weight of the 20th century alone. Others have studied it, documented it, argued over it, mourned within it. The purpose of tracing such a journey is not to dwell endlessly in darkness, but to illuminate how fragile and how resilient human systems can be. So the noise recedes further. The bunker becomes only a historical site beneath your feet. The courtroom quiets. The maps fold closed. The child in Braunau, the failed painter in Vienna, the soldier in muddy trenches, the orator in beer halls, the dictator in a grand office, the figure in a concrete shelter, all dissolve into the steady, measured cadence of history, examined and remembered. The lights dim softly now. The echoes fade into something calmer, less jagged. You breathe in, slow and steady, aware that even the most turbulent chapters eventually settle into pages turned gently in the dark. And as the city outside rests beneath a quieter sky, you let the final image soften, not of fire or fury, but of morning light touching rebuilt stone. A reminder that after even the longest night, the world somehow continues.